Welcome to the deep dive. If you're looking for the shortcut to being well-informed, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're digging into a really stark contrast, something quite dramatic happening in the Caribbean economy right now. We're talking about Cuba. For decades, Cuba seemed to have it all. Amazing location, rich culture, close to huge markets. It was, for a time, a real rising star in tourism. But recently, it's facing a tourism collapse that's just, well, it's incredibly severe and fast. Meanwhile, its neighbors, think the Dominican Republic, Cancun, and Mexico, they're actually breaking visitor records. So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to trace Cuba's tourism path, right from its comeback in the late 80s through its peak years, up to this current crisis, using data right up to mid-2025. We need to understand how they climbed so high, and maybe more importantly, why things seem to be falling apart so quickly now.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've gathered quite a range of sources. There's a key historical analysis from back in 2000 from the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, ASCE. That really sets the stage for the early boom years. Then we've layered on top of that recent news reports, CBC, Rio Times, for instance, plus some academic work looking at the current money situation and political pressures.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting back at the beginning, late 80s, early 90s, setting the stage for these Caribbean giants.
Right. So Cuba officially jumped back into the world tourism scene in 1988, started small, just 309,000 visitors that year. And just for clarity, the analysis we looked at specifically leaves out Puerto Rico. It's a direct link to the U.S., puts it in a totally different category, different rules. This is really about Cuba versus the DR and Cancun head-to-head.
And the competition was intense from the start, wasn't it? Cuba really came out swinging, at least in terms of growth rate.
It really did. If you look at that period, 88 to 99, Cuba had the fastest average annual growth in tourist arrivals. We're talking 16.1% per year.
Wow, 16.1%. That's huge. How did that compare?
Well, it blew the others away on rate. Cancun was growing at 11.6% annually, and the Dominican Republic at 8.2%.
Yeah.
So yeah, Cuba's growth was explosive.
But despite that incredible growth rate, they were still playing catch-up in terms of overall size, right?
Exactly. By 99, Cancun held about 14.3% of the regional market share. The DR had 13%. Cuba, even after that growth spurt, was at about 8%. And a big piece of that was just physical capacity. The DR already had a massive lead in hotel rooms, almost 50,000 back then. Cuba had around 32,300. Cancun was just under 25,000.
Okay, so capacity was one thing, but Cuba seemed to be trying a different strategy too, not just the standard Caribbean sun, sea, and sand package.
That's a really important point. Cuba was actively trying to diversify. They pushed things like diving and fishing, really leaned into cultural tourism, historical sites, the famous Havana Ballet. They even promoted things like hunting and medical tourism, offering treatments cheaper than you'd find in North America, trying to find those niches.
Interesting. So niches like ballet and medical treatments, was that enough to compete with the sheer volume the DR was clearly aiming for?
Well, long term, it seems maybe not. The DR went all in on mass market. By that time, something like 88% of their rooms were all-inclusive. They were built for volume, for package deals. Cuba was aiming for, let's say, diversity and maybe a different kind of quality. Though it's worth keeping in mind, the sources often suggest you should probably knock a star off Cuban hotel ratings to match international standards. The quality control wasn't always consistent.
Right, that makes sense. And did this difference in strategy show up in where the tourists actually came from?
Absolutely. Back in 1999, Europe was crucial for Cuba, 55% of their visitors. Canada was the single biggest source country within that. Cancun, totally different picture, dominated by the U.S. market, 54%. The DR was more of a mix, but still heavily reliant on Europe, too, about 46%. Cuba really depended on those long-haul flights.
Which I guess made them more vulnerable later on when things got complicated.
Precisely. That reliance on specific international markets and maybe international goodwill set the stage for, well, the reversal.
Okay, here's where the story takes that sharp turn. Things really changed. You mentioned a peak.
Yes. So 2018 technically saw the highest total number of visitors, 4.71 million. But a lot of that was cruise ship passengers who don't stay long or spend as much. The real peak for the more valuable overnight visitors, the ones generating serious revenue, was actually 2017. That year brought in about $3.3 billion in gross hard currency. That was the high point for actual tourism income.
And the decline started almost immediately after that peak, even before COVID hit the world.
That's right. The Trump administration started tightening U.S. restrictions. They banned certain types of travel, like individual people-to-people trips, then group ones, and crucially, they stopped U.S. cruise ships from going to Cuba in 2019.
Just those actions had an impact.
a direct one.
Mm.
Visitor numbers dropped by nearly 10% in 2019 alone, largely because of those specific U.S. policy changes. The slide had already begun.
Okay, let's fast forward to now, mid-2025, because the situation is just drastically different. You have the DR, Jamaica celebrating record numbers, and Cuba.
Cuba is struggling profoundly. By 2023, they were only at about 56% of the visitor levels they had back in 2019. They just never recovered momentum after the pandemic lockdowns eased.
And the latest numbers for 2025.
They are, frankly, alarming. In the first 4 months of 2025, Cuba recorded just over 991,000 international visitors.
Okay. How does that compare?
It's a drop, a significant one, nearly 27% lower than the same period in 2024. That's not just stagnation, that's a sharp decline during what should be their high season.
Wow, nearly 27% down year on year. That's not just seasonal fluctuation, is it? That sounds like a real crisis in market confidence.
The sources definitely frame it as a crisis of confidence, and you see the immediate knock-on effects. National hotel occupancy rates, they plummeted to just 24%.
24%. So less than 1 in 4 hotel rooms are occupied. During peak season?
Exactly. Imagine running a hotel with 3/4 of your rooms empty. The economics just don't work.
And that low occupancy must directly impact quality, right? You can't afford the staff, the upkeep, the food quality if you're running that empty.
Precisely. Which feeds right into the quality issues driving tourists away. And it's hitting their core markets hardest. Canada, always their most reliable source, down over 30% in the first quarter of 2025.
Over 30% from Canada and Russia. They'd been a growing market, hadn't they?
They had, but that dropped even more sharply. Russian arrivals fell by over 51% in the same period. These are major hits to their key demographics.
And there was that specific consequence mentioned in the sources, a major Canadian tour operator pulling hotels.
Yes, that was Sunwing. They reportedly removed 26 Cuban hotels from their offerings entirely. The reasons cited: customer complaints about quality. That sends a very negative signal to the whole travel industry.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. Section 3, what's actually driving this collapse? You called it a double whammy.
Yeah, it seems to be a combination of external pressures and internal problems, and they really feed off each other.
So, a perfect storm. But which factor feels like the bigger driver right now, based on the sources? Is it the external sanctions or the internal meltdown?
It's tricky, but the argument seems to be. External pressures create the uncertainty and access issues, but it's the internal collapse that's wrecking the actual tourist experience and pushing people to choose competitors.
Yeah.
Externally, a huge factor is the U.S. designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. That reportedly had a direct impact on European travelers,
How so?
because visiting a country on that list can disqualify you from the U.S. electronic visa program, ESTA. Reports suggest around 300,000 Europeans who previously visited Cuba were denied ESTAs. That makes future travel to the U.S. complicated, so they might just avoid Cuba altogether.
Ah, okay. So that instantly makes places like the DR, which don't have that political baggage, much more appealing for Europeans who might also want to visit the U.S. later.
Exactly. But then you have the internal issues, which sound increasingly severe and directly impact anyone visiting.
Right. The sources paint a picture of an economy in deep crisis, the worst in decades.
Yes. And tourists can't be shielded from it anymore. The infrastructure is unreliable. Think frequent, widespread power outages. The reports mentioned major grid failures in October, December, March recently.
Hard to sell a carefree beach vacation when the lights go out and the air conditioning dies.
Precisely. And the shortages are biting hard. Food, clean water, medicine, even fuel. This hits tourist services directly. Restaurants have less variety. Transport is difficult.
And safety concerns, too.
Reports mention rising street crime, things like pickpocketing, more visible begging, spilling out beyond the traditional tourist zones. It erodes that feeling of safety.
And on top of all that, the people who actually run the hotels and services are leaving.
And that's a huge factor. An estimated 10,000 Cuban tourism workers have either quit the sector or left the country altogether. That's a massive loss of experienced staff. Now I see the results. Poor food quality, hotels falling into disrepair, bad beds, no hot water, lack of basic maintenance, even in places that are supposed to be higher end. The service quality is declining sharply.
It sounds like a vicious cycle. Poor conditions drive away tourists, less revenue makes conditions worse.
Exactly. Which brings us to the underlying economic crisis fueling all this, the dollar crunch.
Right. This tourism decline didn't happen in a vacuum. Cuba's facing a severe balance of payments crisis. Their ability to import goods has plummeted. Merchandise imports literally halved between 2011 and 2020. And weren't there other sources of hard currency also drying up, like payments for sending doctors abroad?
Yes, especially from Venezuela. They stopped paying in actual dollars for those medical services, which was a huge blow to Cuba's foreign currency reserves.
So this desperate lack of dollars forced the government into some drastic monetary changes in 2021.
It did. January 2021 saw massive shifts. First, they finally unified their two currencies, the regular Cuban peso, CUP, and the convertible peso, CUC, that tourists used to use. And second, simultaneous with that unification, they enacted a huge devaluation of the official exchange rate.
Huge is right. It went from the old artificial rate of 1-to-1, $1 equals 1 CUP, to a new official rate of $1 equals 24 CUP. Overnight, that's a 2,300% devaluation.
Correct. But that official rate of 24-to-1 became almost instantly irrelevant on the street. The black market, or informal market rate, just exploded.
How bad did it get?
Well, at the end of 2020, the black market rate was maybe 32 CUP to the dollar. By September 2021, just 9 months after the official devaluation to 24, the black market rate hit 60 CUP to the dollar, and it's gone much higher since. This massive gap just destroyed confidence.
And the government tried to control the dollars coming in, especially from family remittances, using a special kind of bank account, the MLC.
Yes, the MLC Moneda Libremente Convertible, or freely convertible currency accounts. That name is a bit misleading, though.
How do they actually work?
Essentially, people deposit real foreign currency dollars, euros, into these state bank accounts. The state keeps the hard currency. In exchange, the account holder gets electronic credit, the MLC. But here's the catch. You can't easily convert that MLC back into physical dollars. You can only spend it electronically at specific state-run stores, often called MLC stores. It's a mechanism for the state to capture scarce foreign currency.
Which gives those state-run MLC stores a total monopoly on where people can spend that money, and they can set prices accordingly.
Exactly. They have immense pricing power. And the research cited in the sources is pretty shocking here. It found that, on average, prices in these MLC stores carry a gross margin of 87% over the estimated cost of the goods.
Wait, an 87% average markup?
Yes, and for basic staple goods like long-grain rice, the margin was found to be as high as 131%.
That's effectively a massive tax on remittances and any foreign currency coming into the hands of ordinary Cubans.
It functions that way, yes. And it has the effect of discouraging remittances because the family member receiving the funds gets so little actual purchasing power for the dollar sent. It further restricts the inflow of hard currency the country desperately needs.
Yeah.
A really difficult situation.
So pulling this all together,
Oh.
what's the takeaway here? It seems like we have three huge forces crushing Cuban tourism. Aggressive U.S. sanctions, worsened by that terrorism designation.
Right.
Then these deep structural flaws in Cuba's own state-controlled economic and tourism model, like still planning to build hotels when occupancy is barely 24%. And finally, the direct result on the ground. The shortages, the power cuts, the poor service, all driving visitors straight to competitors who offer a much easier, more reliable experience.
That sums it up well. And despite this grim reality, the government's official ambitions, as noted in the sources, remain sky high. They once talked about developing 172,500 rooms by 2010 that required building 14,000 new rooms every year.
Which was always dependent on U.S. restrictions easing and massive foreign investment, right?
Yeah.
Something like $22 billion.
Exactly. Billions in investment that just isn't materializing under current conditions.
So what's a more realistic projection now?
Well, analysts cited in the material suggest that Cuba might realistically add maybe 10,000 to 15,000 total new rooms over the next 5 to 7 years. Not per year.
Oh.
That potential has been drastically scaled back by the crisis.
It's incredible. That original ASCE report from 2000 saw Cuba as having potentially the greatest growth prospects in the Caribbean, but explicitly tied it to political normalization with the U.S. So here's a final thought for you, our listener. We see that Cuban Americans, people with direct family ties to the island, are increasingly choosing to vacation elsewhere, specifically the Dominican Republic. The number of Cuban citizens visiting the DR jumped from 34,000 in 2019 to 85,000 in 2024. If Cubans themselves are opting for a neighboring island for their holidays, what does that suggest about the actual quality and appeal of Cuba's tourism offering right now, regardless of sanctions or who's allowed to visit? Something to think about.